Welcome. I'm Donna Parisi, head of the Asset Management Group, located here in New York at Shearman and Sterling. And we're glad you can make it tonight. The topic is derivatives clearing. You know, some 2.5 years after the passage of Dodd-Frank, we are finally entering the implementation phase. We can't avoid it anymore. And one of the first things we're going to be facing is the mandatory clearing of certain derivative contracts. I wanted to start out by having our panelists introduce themselves so you get a sense of who they are, their specialties, their backgrounds, and where they're located, because a particular focus of this presentation is a comparison between where we are in the U.S. on derivatives clearing and what's going on in the UK and EU. A little bit behind us in terms of timeline, but it's coming, and I think it's important for global institutions to understand where we are and where we're going in both places in the world. So let me start out with Don Lamson. Can I ask you to introduce yourself, and then we'll move on from there?
Sure. Hi, I'm Don Lamson. I'm a partner in the Washington office and head of the FIA practice down there. I spent some time in the government before I came here and worked on Dodd-Frank.
He's being a bit modest. First of all, FIA stands for our Financial Institution Advisory and Financial Regulatory Practice, and Don spent 30 years at the OCC, where he was seconded to Treasury and was actually responsible for drafting portions of Title VII and the Volcker Rule. So you can save your boos and hisses until the end.
She's more complete than I am.
When you get your tomatoes, please be accurate, because I'm in the firing line here. My name is Thomas Donegan. I'm a partner in London in the same group as Don, covering clearing banks and funds and looking at how these challenges have to be met.
I'm Ian Harvey-Samuel, a partner in London in the Derivatives Structured Finance Group. With Thomas, we're very heavily involved working with clearing houses, brokers and clients on the implementation of client clearing.
Jeff Goldman, a partner in the New York office, also in the derivatives and structured products practice, and working together with my colleagues in London on derivatives clearing in various forums.
Barney Reynolds, I'm a partner in the London office in Financial Institutions Advisory, again doing derivatives clearing very heavily for clearing houses and others.
James Duncan, I'm also a partner in the London office specialising in derivatives and structured products.
Hi, I'm John Adams, and despite my name bearing an uncanny resemblance to a former president, I am British, and I'm in the investment funds team based in London.
Hi, my name is Jiří Krόl. I head the Government and Regulatory Affairs team at the Alternative Investment Management Association, which is a hedge fund association based in London with members worldwide, including the United States. Hopefully many of you here.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of what we're going to be covering this evening. So, the key features of Title VII of Dodd-Frank as it applies to derivatives are registration classes derivatives and reporting requirements that touch virtually all derivatives, whether they're cleared or uncleared. And then finally, the clearing of derivatives. Now, we can debate whether or not we think central clearing of derivatives really is an adequate or efficient risk mitigation tool, but the fact of the matter is that it's both here in the U.S. to stay, and as Barney will describe in a few minutes, also in the EU and UK. So what we need to do now is face this reality and understand the pros and cons of clearing, how it affects where we hold our customer assets, what protections we're afforded, costs, liquidity. So there's not necessarily easy answers as to whether clearing of derivatives is good or bad. It just is. As we'll touch on, there are exemptions from mandatory clearing requirements, specifically for end users of derivatives. But even if you could take advantage of an end-user exception, I think you still have to undergo the analysis of does it make sense given market conditions, my own state of affairs as to whether or not I want to clear a particular class of derivatives or not. So we're going to start today with a brief description of the clearing basics, such as the principal versus agency model, direct versus indirect clearing, the role of the FCM in the U.S., the new cleared derivatives environment, and clearing brokers in Europe. the extraterritorial scope of both Dodd-Frank and EU regulation and the challenges it presents for global institutions, segregation of customer funds and the porting of positions under the two different regimes, documentation for clear derivatives, both in the state of affairs in the U.S. and in the EU, and what the buy side should consider when putting in place this documentation. Collateral arrangement. The U.S. has a security interest model for taking security and collateral, where the U.K. has title transfer, and that presents some unique challenges in the cleared derivative space that we'll touch on. And we'll also ask John to give us a few words on how the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive relates to clearing. And it does touch upon U.S. managers that are selling into Europe or trading into Europe. So John will talk about that. And then we're going to end with Jiří, and he's going to give us the fund industry perspective on derivatives clearing, what the concerns are for funds that operate in both the United States, the U.K., and globally, and we'll end there. We'll see if we have time for questions. So we have a slide deck. I think you have some handouts. We're not going to speak to the slides. There's just really too much information in the slides for us to cover, and I think it'll be more interesting if we have more of a dialogue among the panelists. So I'll be moderating, asking some questions, and if we run out of time at the end, we'll be available during the cocktail reception to answer any particular questions that you have. So with that, I'm going to turn to Jeff Goldman and Barney Reynolds, and I'm going to ask you to just summarize where we are in terms of clearing of derivatives in the U.S. and the U.K. So, Jeff, why don't I start with you?
Sure. Dodd-Frank, as you know, contemplates that certain derivatives will become subject to mandatory clearing, and the CFTC has issued its first set of final rules governing and requiring certain products to be mandatorily cleared. Those products are four basic types of interest rate swaps, the kind of simple fixed for floating swaps, FRAs, overnight interest rate swaps, and the like. And in the credit default swap area, two kinds of index credit default swaps, CDX index and iTraxx Europe index. So those products will become subject to mandatory clearing. Depending on the parties involved, that will start as soon as March of this year for dealers and active funds, in June for other financial entities, and kind of September for everybody else who is required to clear. There is an exemption from clearing for people who are non-financial end users who are hedging, but that's kind of the basic way of the clearing land.
Great. I don't know if anybody put the slide to slide 13. And Barney, where do we stand in the EU and UK with respect to clearing of derivatives?
Sure. I suppose the first thing, just taking a step back, there's one topic just to be aware of as a backdrop in the EU before you get to clearing, which is a trading regulatory framework. So basically entering into a derivatives contract with anyone in Europe in principle is regulated, and it's already regulated. But from overseas, so if you phone someone in Europe, at the moment there's no harmonized perimeter, so it's a state-by-state analysis of whether you're caught at all. And in the UK, so long as you phone professionals only, you're basically exempt. That regime looks as if it may be maintained under the so-called MiFID II regulatory framework, which is part and parcel of what goes to regulate derivatives exchange and clearing space going forward. But it's something that's a backdrop to everything we're about to talk about in Europe, which is on top of everything that you've got in the US. This is a separate angled regime to consider in addition to everything we're talking about. On the derivatives clearing side itself, the timetable is set out here in Europe. From this summer, the derivatives clearing obligation could kick in. In reality, we're expecting it probably to be later than that, maybe even later summer next year. The concept is very similar to what's in the States, so I won't go over everything in detail, but we have an end-user exemption. We will have most likely the same sorts of products listed, CDS, basically interest rates, possibly, unlike you, some FX products. So it's a very similar framework globally because it's backed up of the G20 initiative. Basically, any financial institution, and that covers funds managed by an AIFM, that's the European Authorized Fund Manager, or a non-financial counterparty engaged in derivatives over a certain threshold is caught by the rules if they're engaged in if they're entering into contracts for a standardized derivative. And then as an extraterritorial matter, perhaps I can go into that and then we can come back to the US on that. Basically, if you've got an AIFM that manages your fund, you are in European terms a financial institution, and if you if you then enter into a derivative contract with anyone, that in principle has to be picked up by the European rules. If you haven't got an AIFM, an authorized fund manager in Europe under this new AIFMD regime that's coming in, then you will be caught if you deal with the European, and the transaction would be caught where it's in Europe, i.e. It's in a standardized derivative, or if you deal with an American or anyone else outside Europe, but it has a direct, substantial and foreseeable effect in Europe, or it's necessary and appropriate to regulate it to prevent evasion. And that basically would pick up a trade if you're dealing with a subsidiary, perhaps of a European entity, which they should have done in their head office, in their home state, or if it affects the Eurozone, for instance, the Eurozone CDS.
Great. Let's take a step back and talk about the different clearing models that are prevalent in the U.S. and EU. So before I go to Jeff to talk a little bit about the extraterritorial reach of Dodd-Frank, can you explain to us what a principal-based clearing model is? Because in the U.S. we're used to an agency-based model.
Right.
And I think it's going to have implications for the way collateral is held, and the way closeout happens.
And I'll just flip to page 10 because that shows it pictorially. So if something has to be cleared, there's a fundamental difference in the legal relationships in Europe as opposed to those in the US. So in the US setup is on the right. You've got, if you are picked up in the US regime, you clear through an FCM clearing member who will hold the collateral by way of pledge. So it'll be ring-fenced from its insolvency, and then it'll pledge onwardly to the clearinghouse. That clearinghouse, by the way, and we'll come back to this, could be in Europe. And that will be ring-fenced from the clearinghouse insolvency. And obviously the FCM or the clearinghouse will use that if they need to, but only if they need to, and otherwise it's left outside the estate. And the client has, through on the right-hand side, a direct relationship with the clearinghouse. On the left-hand side, you've got the European model, which is basically the predominant model in Europe. I mean, there is the use in very small, limited circumstances already now in Europe of a pledge model, but basically because the law is less robust in relation to a pledge, or just historically been, people have used title transfer, where basically if you go to a European clearing member, they will take your collateral on by way of title transfer, so they own it outright, and they will pass it onwardly to the clearinghouse. You won't have a direct relationship with the clearinghouse. And in principle, therefore, it's a slightly riskier situation because you're a creditor of the clearing member. You're protected because of new rules on porting insofar as the assets are at the clearinghouse. But insofar as the assets are not at the clearinghouse and are on their way back to you through the clearing member, you're a mere creditor. So that's a fundamental difference which is important to bear in mind. It will have all sorts of knock-ons which we'll be talking about throughout it in terms of risk and relationships.
Thank you. All right, so Jeff, I thought that I only needed to use an FCM if I was trading futures contracts. Why are we talking about FCMs and not ISDAs and banks and dealers when we talk about cleared derivatives?
Well, one of the features of Dodd-Frank is a requirement that any swap customer, and this really means any U.S. customer trading cleared swaps, must clear through an FCM. And so this is an attempt to force the clearing of swaps into the model that is historically being used for futures as well. So any U.S. customer, at least, and there is some question as to who exactly a U.S. person is at this point, but if you are a U.S. person and you clear a swap, you would need to go through an FCM for that clearing relationship. And that, as Ronnie said, that FCM can then become a member of various clearinghouses in the U.S. or outside the U.S. One of the significant things, though, is as the CFTC has been interpreting this, you need to have an FCM all the way through the chain. So in the futures world, you do not. So you may clear through an FCM who then will clear through a local clearing member who is not an FCM at a foreign clearinghouse. For swaps, you can't do that. You have to get the FCM either has to be a direct member of the clearinghouse or has to go through some other FCM that is a direct member. But in either case, the whole chain of the relationship has to be through FCMs if you have a U.S. Origin customer.
Okay, so I'm hearing from you guys that there's going to be a mandatory clear requirement in the EU, in the U.S.
Right.
In the U.S., I've got to clear through an FCM. What does that mean for me if I want to trade contracts both in the U.S. and in Europe? And, you know, it sounds like I may have two different clearing requirements that are applicable to me.
I think that is possible. I mean, the Dodd-Frank scope of extraterritoriality is potentially very broad. The CFTC has issued proposed guidance. It hasn't finalized it, but proposed guidance as to how Dodd-Frank, including the clearing requirement, is supposed to apply in the cross-border context. What they have basically said is if one party to a trade is a U.S. person, again, the U.S. person is still a little bit up in the air, but if you are a U.S. person and one side of the trade is U.S., the U.S. requirements may apply, which would mean that if it's subject to mandatory clearing, if it's in one of these categories, it would have to be cleared through a registered, CFTC-registered derivatives clearinghouse. Now, some of those clearinghouses are also located outside the United States. So there are, for example, clearinghouses in Europe that are duly registered with the CFTC and with European regulators. That might be one way it's possible to comply with both clearing requirements. But there is, at the moment at least, a possibility of having dual clearing requirements. And although the agencies have said they recognize that may be a problem, they haven't figured out how to solve it.
And Barty, what's going on in Europe on this point?
Europe's, I think, more flexible potentially because of the sort of recognitions already in place. So the obligation, if you're caught by it in Europe, is to clear with central counterparty authorized in Europe, and that's basically any of the ones set up in Europe are going to be authorized under this framework, or recognized in Europe as applying and enforcing equivalent standards. The UK has already recognized the main US central counterparties, and it's very likely Europe will recognize them as well. So it's likely that you can clear, you can satisfy that clearing obligation in Europe by clearing on a US or European clearinghouse. Furthermore, actually, you can also satisfy the obligation in Europe by clearing through a clearing member anywhere in the world, but with a European or a recognized non-European clearinghouse. So you can clear with an FCM that's a member of either Europe or LCH, for instance, even if the FCM isn't in Europe, which it won't be. So actually, in Europe, you can go outside it quite easily, so long as at the end of the chain it comes back into Europe or something that's equivalent.
I'm going to take a little bit of detour before I ask you to speak a little bit about margin, which will then be a nice segue to some of our other speakers on the panel. But reporting requirements. What has to be reported by whom under both EU and U.S. rules? Jeff, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, in the U.S., the basic rule is that all swaps, cleared or uncleared, will need to be reported to a swap data repository. In most cases, there's a set of rules as to who has to do the reporting. Generally speaking, if it's a trade between an end user and a dealer, the dealer will have to report. So most of the time for an end user dealer trade, the dealer is going to take care of this, will have the obligation to take care of it, and the end user won't have any particular obligation to do anything other than just be aware that its trades are being reported to the repository. There are cases, if you're not dealing with a dealer, where an end user may have to report. There's a hierarchy depending on is one in the U.S., is somebody not in the U.S. It can also be, in some cases, varied by agreement between the parties as to who reports. But for most dealer to non-dealer trades, it is the dealer who will have this obligation, and this will be for trades whether they're cleared or not.
And in Europe, the position, as you can see on the slide, is almost identical. You've got to report, though, to a European trade repository, and there are some in place. And insofar as a trade isn't capable of being dealt with by a trade repository, you have to report it to the pan-European regulator, ESMA.
Great. I'm going to ask Thomas and Donna in a minute to comment on how margin is held under the two different regimes. But before we get there, Jeff, maybe you could talk a little bit about, I understand that in the U.S. now we have to have gross margining of clear derivative positions. And what are the implications of that? And I think it's different in Europe, and Barney can follow up with that commentary.
I mean, under the revised CFTC rules, a clearinghouse is required to collect margin based on a margin methodology that's approved by regulators. And one of the changes following Dodd-Frank is that the DCO has to collect margin on a gross basis for all customers. So If you have customer A, clearing through an FCM who has a long position and customer B who has an offsetting short position, historically in the futures world, the FCM would collect margin from both customers, but would only post a net margin for those two positions to the clearinghouse. The clearinghouse now will be required to collect the full margin from both customers through the FCM. So that means more margin will end up at the DCO. Coupled with some of the other changes that have been made in LSOC, which Don and Thomas will talk about, I think the idea is to enhance protection of that margin by keeping it at the DCO rather than at the FCM.
And in Europe, the starting point for understanding this is that the clearinghouses have to offer two types of account as a minimum. One is individual segregation, and the other is an omnibus account. If you go into an individually segregated account, it will be gross margin. It will have whatever margin it needs against the positions you've got. So there's no sort of finessing there. If you go into an omnibus account with other customers as clearing member, there isn't a requirement for gross margining, although many clearinghouses are de facto taking gross margin. But in theory, in principle, you could have net margining. One of the limitations of that, potentially, and we can talk about this more in the context of porting, is that on a net margined account, if everyone wants support in that omnibus account, they all have to go to the same place. Whereas if you've got gross margining in an omnibus account and you want to pick that apart and say, I'm going here and the other people can go wherever they want, then obviously it's easier to do that at the clearing, or you can do that at the clearinghouse level when you've got gross margin. If you haven't, then there are more complicated structures that have to be put in place at the clearing member level to deal with the putting back together of the various bits of margin and allowing you support.
All right. Well, following Lehman Brothers and that's global, Peregrine, market participants are very concerned about where their assets are held, how safe they are, and what will they get back in the event of the bankruptcy of the person holding their collateral. So, in the ISDA uncleared world, we have the concept of a credit support annex. You're an unsecured creditor, but there are techniques you can put in place, particularly third-party segregation, that can keep the assets out of the bankruptcy estate of your counterparty and do a very good job of protecting your assets. When we move to the cleared derivative space, Thomas and Don, should I be worried about who's holding my collateral, and how do I best protect myself?
Well, the first question, I think you still have to be worried about who's holding your collateral, but we can go into exactly why in a moment. What we were going to talk about in this little section of the talk was to focus on some of the new requirements which are applicable at the level of clearinghouses. I know most of the people here aren't representing clearinghouses, but you need a good understanding of that in order to work out how this all fits together for funds and other users of the market. One of the main reasons for using clearing was on slide 4, which is that people can net down their exposures from kind of an uncontrolled mess that the regulators can't monitor to a single net position with a central counterparty. But another important piece of clearing, of course, is that in the last financial crises, it was a piece of financial infrastructure that operated very well. Margins were considered to be sufficient. Many of the positions at clearinghouses could be rolled over from the insolvent clearing member to a solvent clearing member. So funds who spend a lot of money establishing a particular market position didn't have to spend a lot of money re-establishing it. They could just move it to a new clearing broker. What has happened not so successfully probably is the porting of margin. So if you have collateral at a clearinghouse, we've seen instances where some of that's been moved across, probably not all of it, depending on how much money those accounts have lost between the time of insolvency and when porting took place. And what the regulators have tried to do in the latest set of developments, as well as forcing people into clearinghouses, is also to try and improve the security further, which they provide by stipulating additional levels of segregation at CCP level, which should result in protections for funds. Pass on to Don, who'll go through LSOC first.
Sure. So LSOC is, Washington loves acronyms, and this is legally segregated and operationally commingled. So Dodd-Frank required FCMs to segregate collateral deposited or cleared swap and to be able to account for and maintain that collateral. and not commingle it with its own property, and to provide for limits on the reinvestment of collateral by the FCM and the DCO for that matter. The CFTC adopted rules effective November last November to implement these provisions. They apply to the DCOs, the derivative clearing organizations, as well as the FCMs, and they prohibit the DCO from using the collateral allocated to one swap customer to benefit another's position. Two types of accounts that the FCM maintains, one at a bank, the other at the DCO, on behalf of the cleared swap customers. The rules are recognize that there are three types of risk, but one that the LSOC focuses on. There's fellow customer risk. That is that if I'm a customer of an FCM, and Thomas is another, and he goes belly up, and he brings down the FCM with him, then all of a sudden I'm at risk to my fellow customer. There are other risks, operational risk and investment risk. Operational risk is basically all of the above mishaps. Someone has a fat finger. The investment risk that the margin's placed in a bad investment. Under the LSOC, the collateral is segregated on the books and records, and the FCM has to report at least once a day and probably twice in most instances on who has what. And we talked about gross margin and the benefits of that, and that should protect me more in the event of Tom's insolvency than, of course, if it were being calculated on a net basis. And it's a wonderful world with all of this, but the problem is the bankruptcy code rears its ugly head, and from my own experience, the last time we tried to amend the bankruptcy code, it took 10 years. So there's a problem with the bankruptcy code now, and that is in the event of the FCM's insolvency, it reaches all customer property. So if you have the double default situation and the FCM goes down, the question arises, how do we square the LSOC regime with the idea that the trustee can reach all customer property? There's the problem. We talked about custodial accounts and why that didn't really work very well. So LSOC will posit is an improvement, but there are a lot of issues, and if you go further into your slides, you can see what they are. One of the problems is, of course, fellow customer risk, and of course that's the prime benefit of LSOC. Fellow customer risk is rare. There may be other types of risk that LSOC really doesn't help with that much. And the staff of the CFTC, I think, recognizes this because when they went final, they said we need to keep looking at this issue and find ways to do it. We may need to import this into the futures model. So the whole idea of segregation of customer assets is subject to debate at this point.
I guess just a couple of observations. So LSOC is an improvement over an omnibus customer account structure, which is traditional and currently in effect in the futures market. And as Don described, it does protect you from that double default risk in certain circumstances. I think the practical effect is that it's only as good as the books and record keeping of the FCM and the DCO, because at any point in time you need to understand where the positions are and what collateral is associated with that position. And to the extent there's a problem with that book and record keeping and reporting, LSOC is going to have problems. And as Don said, it doesn't really deal with investment risk if there's just a default with your investment counterparty. So it is an improvement, but we do want people to understand that it's not perfect, and you do need to consider the credit profile of your FCM and the DCOs that you're dealing with.
Don, if I could just break in one point, and to underline what you just said in one respect in particular, and that is on the record-keeping point. When the FCM is under the stress of a double default, potentially, if you're going to triage what you're going to do while you're trying to flail around, I think keeping great records may not be one of those instances where you're going to devote a lot of your attention. So the risk is that much greater that when you need the good records, you may not have them.
Right. And the real benefit of LSOC is that hopefully it's going to facilitate pre-default porting by having an accurate record of what margin, and what gross margin, in particular in the U.S., is associated with certain positions before the default of an FCM. I think regulators in the market are hopeful that there can be a quick transfer of positions to another solvent FCM, given the fact that we'll know where everything is. I think what we see on the horizon, and maybe Jeff, you want to comment on this, is that there's been a lot of talk about where's the best place to hold excess collateral, the FCM level, the DCO level. What's the trend here?
I think, LSOC permits both. So LSOC, permits a scenario where the excess, meaning the DCO requires a certain amount of margin for customer positions. FCMs will often want more for their own protection. And the question is where that excess piece goes. LSOC permits it to either go to the DCO or stay at the FCM. Either case, it's segregated. I think there is a view among some that putting it at the DCO enhances protection in the sense that it may address some of the, malfeasance or operational risks if it's somewhere else. And there's probably greater visibility and greater ease of porting if the money is in fact at the DCO. That does impose a greater operational burden on DCO and the FCM, and so that piece of LSOC has not really been implemented yet. I don't think any of the DCOs currently hold excess margin at the DCO. I think all of them are planning to do so within the next number of months, but it's simply an operational question of how do you make sure you have records of whose excess it is, what customer does it belong to, how much is there, and keeping that record up to date on a daily or more than daily basis.
So, Thomas, if we go to slide 33, how does segregation work under EMIR?
Yeah, so EMIR is slightly easier in many ways because Dom's just summarized about 150 pages worth of rulemaking. We've got about 5 sentences, so despite having about 300 pages worth of other stuff in EMIR to concern ourselves. So it's actually very light in terms of what it says, and there's a lot of debate about what the segregation requirements really will be in Europe. The idea generally is that CCPs should offer 2 sorts of accounts, as Barney mentioned earlier. An omnibus account in which you will take some kind of fellow customer risk. It's LSOC minus. It's the current futures model, basically. And then an individual segregated account, which is full physical segregation. So if you're a fund, you get your own account at the clearinghouse. You're the only person interested in it. The only assets that go up are your assets. And you know exactly what they are. Potentially you could do that for a group of funds with the same fund manager, so they have a kind of shared individual account, if you like. And those are the 2 models. There's no provision for a kind of LSOC halfway house, although a number of CCPs are looking to implement individual segregation basically with a few kind of rule tweaks to an LSOC model, which you can potentially also do. But at a high level, that's what's going to happen. So I think what will happen in Europe is also you'll see some fee differentials. CCPs are going to have to offer a segregated account with a kind of low level of protection and probably a low cost because they all operate that sort of model already. You may also see individual segregation, possibly different versions of individual segregation, but probably with a higher fee ticket on them. Then there'll be a question for the fund community as to how much segregation they want and how much they want to pay for it. So it's not just going to be a question of that sounds good, I'll have it, but it's a kind of risk-reward decision for people to take.
All right. So I think we'll switch gears now and we'll talk about what documentation you need to put in place when clearing derivatives in the U.S. and in the EU. For those of us that grew up in the OTC derivatives world, we're used to having an ISDA master agreement, a schedule, a credit support annex that governs our relationship with our counterparty. But as we've said, we're now moving to a future-style model where we're going to be doing business with an FCM, so we have an entirely new suite of documentation. The core piece of this documentation is going to be your futures account agreement. We'll have all the terms that will apply to your futures trades as well as your clear derivative trades. Then there's something called the Clear Derivatives Addendum. There's a form of this published by ISDA and FIA jointly, and I'll go into some detail as to the important provisions there. And then there is an execution agreement. So I may execute a transaction with one broker and give it up for clearing by another broker. And so the third piece of the clear derivative puzzle is the execution agreement between me and my executing broker. So I guess one thing to note is due to capital and other reasons, you may find yourself executing with one entity. I've got some competition here. And clearing with another entity. And I'm sure many of you may have heard about the Dodd-Frank Protocol, which is designed to deal with certain external business conduct rules that are applicable to swap dealers. And so those rules are applicable to those people who execute, your clear derivatives as well in the uncleared space. So you may also be asked to sign up to the Dodd-Frank Protocol in the context of clear derivatives execution. The date for that has been pushed back to May 1st, 2013. So we've got a couple more months to get that in place. Okay, futures agreement. Many of you may have futures agreements in place already to govern your futures trading, or you may not. We would encourage you to take another look at that futures agreement once you put clear derivatives under it, because they are different marketplaces, and things that you may not have cared that much about or may not have been important to you in the context of your futures trading may take on an entirely new significance when this agreement is going to be the base agreement that governs your clear derivatives documentation. Now, the challenge for the buy-side community is that, unfortunately, there's not a standard form of futures account agreement that's in widespread use. Each FCM has its own form, so it means that you're going to have to read it carefully and negotiate it, and it's going to take some extra time and investment. Okay. So the types of issues that will be addressed in the futures agreement that you should consider would be margin payment obligations and timing. So is your margin requirement going to be limited to CCP minimums, or is your FCM going to have the ability to call for margin in excess of CCP minimums? And what, if any, are the prior notice periods that are appropriate for calling for such excess margin? Margin transfer timing has become much more of an issue in the clear derivative space. Historically, in the futures arena, your FCM has been willing to, for the most part, fund you overnight. So if you've got a margin call from a clearinghouse today at some point, your agreement may say you just have to deliver it by close of business the next day. So in essence, your FCM was funding you overnight. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on that model in the clear derivative space. Because you have liquidity concerns, you're just going to have a lot more volume, and we're talking billions and trillions of dollars subject to these agreements, and so your FCMs just don't have the liquidity to fund you overnight. There's also going to be capital charges associated with that funding. So I think that as you negotiate these agreements, that's going to be a sticking point, and you're going to have to think about how to deal with that. To compound the problem is also that margin calls may be made with more frequency. So we've always had the concept of an intraday margin call, but now I think you're looking at some of the clearinghouses, like in LCH, that are going to a mini margin call model where they will have multiple margin calls per day. And there are just operational constraints on buy side in transferring money, on a more close to real-time basis that need to be sorted out. So that, coupled with the FCM's reluctance and inability to fund you overnight, is just leading to some, operational issues for the market that's going to have to be sorted out. Events of default and liquidation of positions. So your futures account agreement will have a number of events of default. Again, they're not standardized like in ISDA, so you're going to have to read them carefully, make sure that you're comfortable that they are objective and not subjective. We would counsel clients to avoid anything that makes me nervous types of events. Consider the appropriate cure periods for events. ISDA does have cure periods, so you can look to that for some sort of precedent. Acceptance of orders and position limits. What does the futures agreement say about that? Historically, the relationship with your broker is one that's uncommitted. They can always decide not to take a trade for clearing. And there are position limits that are required by applicable law. But again, your broker oftentimes reserves the right to ask you to reduce your positions, even if they're not bumping up against applicable law position limits. So the question is to make sure that you understand whether or not you have a commitment by your broker, and chances are you will not. So what we counsel clients is to make sure that you have at least one other FCM set up so that, if one broker declines to clear a trade, you've got an alternative. If one broker gives notice of reducing your positions, again, you can port to an alternative. And for the reduction of positions, again, think about some prior notice periods that would make sense given your trading and your relationship with your broker. Portability, transfer positions, and collateral. There is an NFA Rule 2-27 that applies to futures contracts. The NFA has indicated that they're going to apply the same concept to clear derivative transactions. So your broker does have a commitment to transfer your trades at your direction, and you need to consider just the time frame and any condition precedents that may be added to that requirement. So I think those are the major points in the futures agreement to look to. So then you get your OTC cleared addendum, and that agreement is really going to have terms that apply only to your cleared derivative transactions. And if we go to slide 46, you'll see some of the issues that are addressed in a typical OTC cleared derivatives addendum. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them other than to talk a bit about Section 7, which are the liquidation events. So again, there may be additional events of default that are put in there by your broker that differ from the ones in your futures contract. There may not be. They may be the exact same ones. But liquidation of clear derivatives contracts needs some special provisions and some special language. These provisions go on for 2 or 3 pages, and quite frankly, they're a bear to work through. But I think at the end of the day, what gets you comfortable is the liquidation standard. So it basically says that upon the customer's default, the FCM is going to have the right to do lots of things, which I'll get into in a minute. But at the end of the day, they have to act in good faith in accordance with applicable law, using commercially reasonable procedures in order to produce a commercially reasonable result. Now, there was working groups formed with respect to the OTC, the clear derivatives addendum, that had both buy-side participants as well as dealer FCM participants. And there was a lot of negotiation back and forth. I think it's fair to say that neither side is completely happy with where they came out, but it's a compromise both sides of the market can live with. So at the end of the day, I think what gets the buy-side community comfortable is this liquidation standard that requires your FCM to act in a commercially reasonable manner and, again, subject to a lot of debate, produce a commercially reasonable result. You'll see that there's a lot of different concepts in these liquidation provisions. There's an offsetting transaction, so that's something that your FCM can do that will exactly offset your position. There's a risk-reducing transaction. It doesn't get rid of the position in your account, but it reduces the risk. There's a sale or novation transaction, which is sort of a transfer or moving of that position to get it out of your account. And then there is something that's outside of your clear derivatives account called a mitigation transaction, and that's done directly by the FCM to reduce the net risk of customers' positions. One thing that I would like to raise is in the context of ERISA and pension plan assets is that it's not entirely clear that when an FCM is acting and putting on certain of these risk-reducing, offsetting, and mitigation transactions, their fiduciary status. So when you go, for those of you that are involved in pension plan assets, you may find some reluctance by dealers to sign up plan assets to these sorts of addendums. Some dealers are just not willing to do that right now, given the lack of clarity and uncertainty. Others will do so, but they will ask you for a whole bunch of additional reps, and there may be a request for a termination event should there be any determination by the Department of Labor or a court that would construe the FCM to be a fiduciary. So that's sort of in a nutshell where we stand on the U.S. side of things. Ian, in the U.K., where are we?
Slide 53 as a starting point, but just to give you a quick overview of the kind of the differences. So we've talked earlier about the principal-to-principal model, which means that, obviously there's 2 legs to every cleared transaction, the client clearing member leg and the clearing member clearinghouse leg. That has some implications on documentation. You've got more choice, as it were, as to how you can document the relationship with the clearing member. the models that are being developed in Europe are intended to be documentation agnostic in the sense that the client clearing member could decide to make your underlying master agreement, as it were, for your cleared contracts and is the master agreement, the futures style clearing agreement, part of your prime brokerage documentation. And there are also efforts to develop sort of German law and French law versions of master agreements. And I think the overriding point to think about, and this is kind of constantly dogs the discussions about clearing documentation, is your relationship with your clearing broker a sort of clearing as a service-based relationship, or is it a credit relationship? And I think that's being particularly problematic in the European context because the main customer clearing product that's out there at the moment, the LCH swap clear product, had always started from the assumption or implied assumption that the natural underlying documentation between the clearing member and the client was an ISDA master agreement. So if you start from the assumption that you're using the same style of kind of credit-based agreement between yourself and your clearing member, and then you go through a series of amendments which sort of turn what is a bilateral credit document into a sort of one-sided credit document, you will start feeling a bit nervous. You know, how can this be right? The idea that my clearing member can close out when lots of things happen to me, but I have no protections in the document if my clearing member, you know, fails to perform to me or otherwise. You know, I'm concerned about their solvency, for example. So what we found in there's a sort of working group working in London now under the FOA kind of auspices, trying to essentially adapt the FIA addendum for use in a principal-to-principal model and in the sort of different clearinghouse and collateral structures that are used in Europe. Interestingly, that working group is very heavily dominated on the buy side by US-based funds, which seems counterintuitive because, as Jeff was mentioning earlier, if US persons all have to clear through FCMs, the one thing they won't be signing is the European-style documentation to sign up with a non-FCM broker in London. But I think, first of all, people are hoping that many of the funds they manage may not be US persons in the end of the day. But we're also, I think, seeing that the buy-side community who learned quite a bit about what they wanted to achieve in their clearing member buy-side negotiations in the FIA addendum are kind of using the European process to kind of revisit some of that with the increased knowledge that they've gained over the last 18 months, 2 years or so, about how the kind of risk allocation should sit between the clearing member and the client in the context of this cleared documentation. There's one other thing just to bear in mind in the context of European clearinghouses and the style of principal documentation, which is that clearinghouses in Europe set out some kind of overriding standard terms that they expect the clearing member client documentation to incorporate. So to contrast that with the agency relationship in the US, you have an agency cleared position. Effectively, the terms of your cleared contract are set out entirely in the clearinghouse rules and procedures. In a principal-to-principal back-to-back model, you've got essentially an entirely separate contractual arrangement between the client and the clearing member from the entirely separate contract between the clearing member and the clearinghouse. But what the clearinghouse wants to do is they want to kind of make sure that the client and clearing member have contracted with each other on terms that kind of fit the model that we're trying to use to make sure that in the default of the clearing member, you comport the positions and the margin of the client. So the way the clearinghouses are doing that is kind of making these sort of mandatory standard terms. So in getting your head round about what you need to look at, you have to agree with your clearing member what's your underlying document, what are the supplements to that to adapt it for clearing, which clearinghouse standard terms supplement that, and then obviously there's whole parts of the rules and procedures that will vary actually the terms of contracts because, again, as you can imagine in a clearing principal-to-principal model where the clearing member sees himself as a sort of intermediating riskless principal, that they will expect to pass through to you as the end user the effect of any changes that happen to their clearinghouse, clearing member cleared position. So there's quite a lot to get your head around in terms of the kind of paperwork, which is the totality of your contractual arrangement that documents your cleared derivative. The issues that are being debated in Europe otherwise in relation to documentation are very similar to what Donna was talking about. There's probably one difference which is significant in relation to that principal-to-principal model again, which is that in Europe you're likely to be clearing through a broker with whom you also have other non-cleared positions and other arrangements such that from their perspective the net credit exposure they have between you and them is not just based on your cleared exposure. So if you want to pre-default port in Europe, the conditionality that the broker tries to impose is based around, from the broker's perspective, making sure that moving your cleared positions doesn't leave the resulting mix of positions they have left between the two of you change their credit exposure. So one of the most significant negotiating points is obviously minimize the number of those conditions, particularly in circumstances where the reason you want to move is that you're having some kind of disagreement with your clearing broker or some issue where you think you want to be able to exit quickly and you don't have the time to spend a couple of weeks negotiating with them about satisfaction of the pre-default porting condition. Just before we leave the FOA addendum, it may be worth Thomas here on my right just briefly explaining some of the different default scenarios that you see in a principal-to-principal model where you've got effectively the control over the defaults being run by the clearinghouse.
Yeah, so one of the hottest topics on these discussions that Ian and I have been sat in for the last 6 months or so is how events of default are treated. And some of this reflects what's been happening in the FIA addendum also. So you go from a world where you have largely as the master agreements, symmetrical events of default between what's now the clearing member, the bank or the broker, and the fund manager, to a world where you've got three parties who might default and very different consequences of those defaults. The first one is the clearinghouse might go down, and that's something that members, the banking community, are particularly concerned about. The way that's dealt with is that there's effectively a pass-through of whatever the clearing member gets. So if the CCP goes down, the clearing member will have a claim in the insolvency. It'll get X cents in the dollar, and it'll pass on those to the customer on the kind of non-recourse back up to the CCP basis. So funds are taking CCP insolvency risk as the first major change. Looking at a clearing member default, I think this is probably the most controversial one. There basically are no events of default for clearing members under the new agreement. The thinking is that if you are dissatisfied with your clearing member, two things will happen. Either the CCP will call that member in default itself, and then under its default rules, the CCP will port you somewhere else, in which case you can preserve your positions and margin, and you don't need to do anything. Or if you just don't like the clearing member due to service issues, you should just go somewhere else under pre-default porting. And the theory is that removes the need for any clearing member event of default. There are some discussions as to whether funds or other end users who require events of default for capital reasons ought to have one. And then the question is what the remedy would be, and possibly the remedy is porting, so you end up with something that looks quite similar. But that's still being debated in Europe, that issue. And then customer default, the thinking is that will remain currently broadly as is, i.e. the clearing member can still call a fund or a fund manager in default for insolvency or possibly NAV decreases, as they are under current agreements, probably.
Thanks. Jane, you want to talk a little bit about the different collateral regimes and what it means for documentation, and go ahead.
Sure. So in this section we're just going to highlight some of the differences in collateral regimes between the US and the EU. Some of these points have been made before, but it's worth emphasising them. Perhaps the first point we've got here on slide 62 is that the US regime that Don described, LSOC, effectively only allows for gross margining, but in the EU the possibility of net omnibus margining exists. So on the diagram there you can see that in the net omnibus margining this does lead to obviously margin being potentially retained at the clearing member, which then also brings in the other key difference. Another key difference between the EU and the US is that in the EU and in particular in the UK, historically and currently collateral is generally posted on a title transfer basis. That practice is originated because of difficulty in creating effective security interests around the EU, and it may be in the future that more security interest-based structures will be devised. But for the moment, in the EU, the route that people are following is title transfer-based structures, and that's reflected in the documentation. The ISDA FOA addendum incorporates makes use of the English law CSA mechanics. If we were just flicking on a couple of other, I guess, interesting topics relating to the posting of margin would be collateral transformation. Many clients may not have access to the clearinghouse eligible margin, and may make use of the services of their clearing members in order to provide eligible margin at the clearinghouse. An issue for, I guess, on both sides of the Atlantic for clients to consider is what happens to that margin at the SCM or clearing member. If margin is ported at the clearinghouse level, you would still have your. That doesn't mean that actually, of course, that what you originally posted with the SCM or clearing member has moved over as well. One point to note is one specific provision of EMIR, Article 39.6, provides that where you've got you've elected for individual account segregation, that any excess margin has to be posted as a CCP, which obviously is essentially consistent with excess margin being retained as a clearing member. I think on the other topic we were going to just highlight was cross-margining between various elements of cross-margining. Actually, perhaps I suggest to comment on this one, because I think in the US people have said a little bit more about cross-margining, but in the EU it's possible that things will develop such that there's greater flexibility for cross-product and cross-margining than in the US, where you've got a split between different regulators.
There's been some developments, hasn't there, been in cross-margining?
Sure. I think there are a couple. It's important to distinguish a couple of different things. One is kind of cross-margining within a clearinghouse. That is something that can be done under U.S. law. There are, depending on the product category, it is possible with CFTC permission to cross-margin between futures and swaps. What Don is referring to is the CFTC and SEC have now permitted cross-margining between swaps and security-based swaps, particularly in the CDS context, where index CDS is a swap and single-name CDS is a security-based swap. So there, with the appropriate orders from regulators, it's possible to cross-margin between products within the same clearinghouse. Outside of a clearinghouse, between cleared and non-cleared swaps, it is more difficult to cross-margin, although not impossible. The LSOC rules created some confusion here as to what extent the margin that's securing swaps could be used to secure something else. The CFTC has clarified somewhat that a customer can pledge its rights against the FCM for its cleared swaps to secure other things. So there is some possibility of cross-margining between cleared and non-cleared. One of the complications is that, generally speaking, FCMs are used for swaps and futures that are cleared. They're not used for other products typically. So as a practical matter, it can be difficult to achieve the kind of cross-margining that can exist in Europe, where all the products cleared and uncleared go through the same entity.
John, can I just add something to that? I think one of the things that it's a recent development and probably slightly counterintuitive in the context of having spent 4 or 5 years of our lives working on the assumption that the end game here was to post gross margin at clearinghouses, because the only way to port positions and margin was to do it at the clearinghouse, is that we're moving, I think, in a direction where, because of the level of collateral demand, the collateral timing, deliveries, and other things that people are talking about, the cross-margining opportunities, that we may well go eventually to models where much more of the collateral is held outside of clearinghouses in custody-based relationships, where you kind of allocate or change the allocation of who's entitled to the benefit of collateral according to all the various many daily movements and settlements that needed to be put together. So what that means is that the CCPs become the place where you move the positions and you move the margin outside the clearinghouses. And I think that is a sort of a bit of a surprise in the sense that from where we started a couple of years ago. And certainly in Europe, there's some very interesting opportunities to be able to do that. And given that margin and the level of margin you have to provide is probably the single most important issue commercially in terms of client clearing, there's going to be some interesting tension between the two regimes as to which one's the most cost effective, to the extent you have a choice.
All right, I think we're going to shift gears now a little bit. I'm going to ask John Adams to talk about the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive and what its relevance and implication in the clear derivative space is.
Thanks, Donna. This directive is it's a beast. It's a huge directive of huge significance, not just in Europe but actually globally. And now's not the time to launch into a 6-hour lecture on all of its terms, but why it's relevant in this talk, I guess, is that the world would be a bright and beautiful place if we could look at these legislative developments in isolation. Unfortunately, we can't, and with derivatives clearing, we have to look at what's going on elsewhere, and that includes this directive, the AIFMD. We're not very good at acronyms in Europe, so we have AIFMD or AIFMD rather than good things like the Patriot Act and things that are memorable. What is the AIFMD? Just very quickly, it comes into force across Europe from the 22nd of July this year. And basically, it's an entirely new regime for regulating fund managers. Yes, fund managers located in Europe, but it also actually hits on advisors located anywhere in the world that really have businesses that touch the European Union in any way. So advisors that advise European domiciled funds, advisors that want to market their funds into Europe from July this year, even advisors that operate under delegation to a European manager. One of the many fundamental changes that this directive brings in is that a lot of the funds captured by this directive are going to have to appoint a single depository, which is a glorified custodian, and among many other things, has to take responsibility for the assets that it holds in custody. And by take responsibility, I really mean take responsibility, because if those assets get lost, and lost is pretty broadly crafted, it includes the loss, for example, by a sub-custodian, even as a result of the fraud of a sub-custodian. The depository has to make good, effectively, those assets to the fund. So, obviously the question then becomes, well, what assets are held in custody by the depository? And this is where we get back to this wonderful distinction again between the European model of posting collateral on a title transfer basis and clearing through an FCM where collateral gets posted by way of a pledge. In the former, title transfer, clearly the fund no longer owns the collateral. Plain and simple, it's not the fund's collateral anymore. And under the directive, it seems likely that, understandably, the depository won't be responsible for the loss of those assets because they're not actually the fund's assets anymore. And that may have a knock-on consequence for pricing. The depositories, understandably, raising their eyebrows at the fact that they're liable for the loss of assets, will price things accordingly, resulting in increased fees for managers. But clearly, if they're not responsible for assets that are posted by way of collateral by title transfer, then everyone's happy, fees are lower. Contrast that, of course, with assets posted by way of pledge. And if you've got a European fund, for example, that's forced to clear through an FCM because it is a US person, as broadly crafted as that may well be, the depository may actually, incredible as this sounds, be responsible for the loss of those assets because technically the fund will still own those assets, albeit that they're subject to a security and the fund and the depository doesn't actually control those assets. And that's just one example of how this directive interacts with clearing of derivatives and, in fact, many other matters too. Barney, could you just flick on to the next? Thank you. Fascinating topic for everyone, I'm sure. Risk factors is something that we all have to deal with, unfortunately, but every offering document has, or certainly should have, that general risk factor saying, gosh, changes in law and regulation happening all the time. We're not quite sure of the consequences, and but potentially there could be adverse impacts on returns to investors and blah blah blah. That's all well and good, and clearly it needs to be there. But as and when these regulatory developments firm up, then certainly I think the best advice is that specific tailored risk factors are introduced that deal with those specific regulatory developments. And on the clearing of derivatives, we're certainly seeing a trend, shall we say, for including specific risk factors in offering documents dealing with, for example, increased costs, if that's something that looks likely, or indeed if hugely significant amounts of collateral are going to have to be posted when compared with currently, whether or not that might result in a reduction in the number of trades that can actually be effective. Frankly, while you're looking at your offering document, if you're marketing into Europe from July this year, and this is shamelessly nothing to do with derivatives clearing whatsoever, you may as well, at the same time, essentially check your offering document against the checklist that's in the AIFMD directive, because there's a whole load of pre-investment disclosures that have to be made to investors after July of this year. And without going into too much detail, some of those pre-investment disclosures simply won't be in offering documents right now, or I'd be very surprised if they were. Barney, thank you. Again, not really to do with derivatives clearing, but just AIFMD specific. As I said before, this directive really is important for non-European managers. The way of the world, of course, is for extraterritoriality to be the name of the game, and the AIFM directive is no exception to that. And there are some sort of key questions that I've noted there on the slides, but frankly, it all comes down to if anyone hasn't considered the impact of this directive on their business, now is the time to do so.
Thank you. All right, Jiří, can I ask you to comment on the fund industry's perspective on cleared derivatives and financial regulatory reform as it's affecting funds?
Thanks, Donna. And thanks for having me here. And I was excited that I could get away from the AIFMD for once and talk about something else like central clearing. But now that you've brought it up, can't resist. This is indeed a beast that I've been wrestling with for the last 3 years, and we're getting quite close to the end of the process in terms of the European Commission having finally adopted implementing regulations that essentially put the meat on the bones of what we call the Level 1 directive. And I just wanted to advertise that we're very keen to assist our members in sort of getting through the maze, which is the AIFMD, and we'll be publishing a planner so that, as John said, you can get on with thinking about implementation. The key thing about the directive, it offers flexibility, it offers options, and crucially, it is not just about European managers. It is also it is potentially applicable to a much wider set of entities. So Friday or Monday, you'll see we'll be publishing a planner that does guide you through the various steps of identifying whether you are and how in scope of the directive and what it means for you in terms of the next steps that you need to take or the decisions that you ought to think about. Moving on to clearing, I think as a hedge fund and industry association, we've been always quite supportive of the policy move towards central clearing, and we've always were extremely vocal about two things when it comes to central clearing, and try to sort of hold the policymakers who've made those decisions in the G20 and other contexts to the very agreements that they'd made. Number one, that we're going to get a regime which is internationally consistent and doesn't fragment the market, doesn't result in unnecessarily overlapping or burdensome regimes that put people into a situation of facing conflicting provisions of law or regulation. And number two, that we get to a regime which is safe, i.e. that it provides adequate protections for the margin that is being posted as part of these transactions. I unfortunately must say that as of today, we're not quite there yet on both of these important aspects of central clearing. On the international consistency point, the CFTC has recently issued guidance with regards to the application of cross-border or the cross-border application of the Title VII provisions, which has elicited quite a unanimous and robust response, which wasn't really favorable to the proposals, which essentially extended the rules of, under Title VII to substantial swath of participants which would normally not be deemed U.S. persons. So the definition of a U.S. person and this coupled with the fact that whenever somebody deals with a U.S. person under Dodd-Frank, they need to follow the Title VII, meant that if you define the U.S. person very broadly, which is what was proposed initially, you will have very few people on this planet that will not be required to be in compliance and clear under Title VII. Now, the interesting thing is that the European directive, EMIR, also provides for similar provisions of pulling potentially people into the EMIR regime, even if the transaction happens between counterparties which are not established in the EU, as long as, it was mentioned before, the contract has some impact on the EU economy. Interestingly enough, if you think about the swaps that are going to be mandated for clearing in the first round, both jurisdictions have selected swaps that are potentially, one can potentially claim that both of them fit the bill of having an impact on the respective economy. So we're in a state where both jurisdictions can claim that both types of, or the set of swaps that are mandated for clearing should be cleared in both jurisdictions, which obviously creates potential problems. Now it was mentioned that there is a possibility for the EU authorities to recognize the other third country regimes which are equivalent, and therefore allowing entities, EU entities that trade with third country entities, to clear in those third countries like the United States. However, it's clear from the response of the European Commission to the proposed CFTC guidance that under the initial proposal, it is unlikely that the European Commission would recognize the U.S. regime as falling into that sort of equivalent bucket. Therefore, we have still some way to go in reaching an appropriate scope of application of the respective regime and reaching some kind of recognition that both regimes are equally applicable, and that neither one is overreaching too much into the other territory. Obviously, for us, choice is extremely important. Being able to decide whether one wants to clear in a European clearinghouse or a U.S. clearinghouse would be great. So to the extent that we can move away from sort of automatic choice of jurisdiction that is done by rules, that would be wonderful. Again, we're not there yet, but we hope that we're going to get.
So with that, I know we've covered a lot of ground. As I said, The slides have, additional material in them. We've also, I think, included some publications from Shearman and Sterling that touch upon some of these issues that we hope you find interesting, and we encourage you to reach out to any of us with, questions specific to your circumstances. Thank you very much for coming. I encourage you to stay. We'll mingle, get to know you.